In the chaos of World War II, fear had many sounds. The thunder of artillery, the scream of aircraft diving from the sky, the grinding roar of tanks pushing through shattered streets. But veterans from the Eastern Front would later speak of another sound, one that terrified them in a way nothing else did. It wasn't slow or distant. It came in a violent, tearing rush, like fabric being ripped apart by invisible hands. And once it began, it didn't stop until magazines ran dry or bodies hit the ground. For years, historians assumed this fear belonged to the enemy, German soldiers caught in the crossfire of Soviet assaults. But hidden in diaries, whispered in reunions, and quietly acknowledged in training reports was a far more disturbing truth. Some of the men who feared that sound the most were the ones producing it. They knew that when the trigger was pulled, control vanished, chaos took over, and survival became a matter of luck, not skill. Why would an army knowingly issue a weapon that could kill its own soldiers? Why would commanders double down on it even as casualties mounted? And how could something so dangerous become one of the defining tools that helped decide the outcome of the largest war in human history? The answer was buried after 1945, uncomfortable for victors and inconvenient for legends. But by the end of this story, you'll understand why this weapon was both a savior and a silent executioner, and why its true role in World War II was never fully admitted. Before we uncover this gripping chapter of history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss the moments that shaped our world. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And whatever you do, stay with me until the very end, because the final twist in this story isn't just shocking, it rewrites everything you thought you knew.
On 22 June 1941, the eastern borders of the Soviet Union exploded into fire and steel. As dawn crept across forests and fields, Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion ever attempted. More than 3 million Axis troops surged forward, supported by tanks, aircraft, and artillery on a scale the world had never seen. Within hours, Soviet defenses began to collapse. Entire air fleets were destroyed on the ground. Command posts went silent. Units were encircled before they even understood they were under attack. The Red Army entered the war crippled by years of internal purges that had removed experienced commanders and replaced them with officers chosen for political loyalty rather than competence. Orders from Moscow were often contradictory, delayed, or impossible to execute. In some sectors, soldiers were sent to the front without rifles, told to pick them up from fallen comrades. Against the German blitzkrieg, the Soviet military appeared outdated, disorganized, and fatally unprepared. Western observers predicted a rapid German victory. Some believed the Soviet Union itself would cease to exist within months. Yet what Germany underestimated was the Soviet willingness to sacrifice everything: doctrine, tradition, and human lives in order to survive. As German forces advanced deeper into Soviet territory, entire cities were dismantled and moved east. Factories were stripped down piece by piece and loaded onto trains under bombing raids. Workers slept beside machines. Teenagers and elderly men replaced skilled machinists who had gone to the front. Production quotas were measured not in quality, but in sheer numbers. In this desperate environment, Soviet leadership faced a brutal reality. The Red Army needed weapons that could be built fast, issued fast, and used by men with minimal training. Precision engineering was a luxury the USSR could no longer afford. What mattered was volume, of production and of fire. The battlefield itself was changing. Forests, villages, and ruined cities turned engagements into brutal, close-range fights where speed and aggression mattered more than marksmanship.
Before the war, submachine guns had been seen as secondary weapons, useful for specialists, but not standard infantry. That assumption collapsed in 1941. German troops armed with automatic weapons were devastating Soviet rifle units in close combat. Soviet commanders took notice. What they needed was a weapon that could dominate space through raw firepower, even if it lacked finesse. The solution came from a man whose background mirrored the simplicity of his design. Georgy Shpagin was not an elite academic engineer. He was a self-taught inventor who understood manufacturing realities better than theory. His task was clear: create a submachine gun that could be mass-produced under wartime conditions, even by factories that had never built weapons before. Every unnecessary part was removed. Machining steps were replaced with stamping. Screws were replaced with welds. The design favored speed of production over refinement. What emerged was a weapon that would become iconic. It was compact, rugged, and brutally simple. It fired a pistol cartridge at an exceptionally high rate, unleashing a torrent of bullets with a single pull of the trigger. In testing, it proved devastating at close range. A short burst could fill a room with lead. To commanders desperate for a way to halt German momentum, it seemed like the perfect answer. By late 1941, the weapon was being rushed to the front in enormous numbers. Training was minimal. Some soldiers fired it only once before combat. Safety briefings were brief or non-existent. The philosophy was clear: hesitation killed, aggression saved lives, or at least achieved objectives. Soldiers were encouraged to advance while firing, overwhelming German positions with noise and shock. The sound it produced quickly became legendary. German soldiers learned to recognize it instantly. Many described it as terrifying, not because of accuracy, but because of its relentlessness. Once it started, it felt as if the air itself was hostile. Captured examples were eagerly used by German troops, who admired its close-range lethality. In Soviet propaganda, the weapon became a symbol of resistance, of turning the tide through sheer willpower and industrial might. But beneath this image lay a growing problem that few wanted to acknowledge. The same features that made the weapon effective also made it dangerous to its users. Its high rate of fire made control difficult, especially for exhausted or inexperienced soldiers. The heavy drum magazines were awkward and prone to feeding issues if improperly fitted. In winter conditions, metal contracted and lubrication froze, increasing the risk of malfunctions and accidental discharges. Combat on the Eastern Front was chaotic beyond anything previously seen. Mass assaults involved dozens of men charging through smoke, rubble, and darkness, often firing blindly. In such conditions, bullets did not distinguish between enemy and ally. Friendly fire incidents became disturbingly common, particularly in urban fighting, where walls and floors funneled ricochets in unpredictable ways. Soldiers were hit from behind, from the side, and sometimes from weapons dropped or mishandled in the rush forward. Official reports rarely mentioned these incidents directly. Losses were recorded, objectives assessed, and operations continued. To slow production or rethink doctrine would have been unthinkable. The Red Army was fighting for survival, and survival demanded weapons that could be replaced faster than lives. The cost was accepted silently, absorbed into the staggering casualty figures that defined the Eastern Front. By the end of 1941, it was clear that the Soviet Union had not collapsed. German forces were halted outside Moscow, bloodied and unprepared for the scale of resistance they faced. Among the reasons for that survival was a weapon that flooded the battlefield with fire, fear, and chaos. It was a weapon that embodied the Soviet war effort itself, powerful, crude, and indifferent to the individual lives consumed in its use. What Soviet commanders did not yet fully grasp was that this weapon was reshaping not only tactics, but the psychology of their own soldiers. And as the war dragged on into its most brutal years, the consequences of that transformation would become impossible to ignore.
On 23 August 1942, the city of Stalingrad vanished beneath fire. German bombers turned entire neighborhoods into smoking ruins within hours, killing tens of thousands of civilians and transforming a living industrial city into a jagged landscape of concrete, twisted steel, and ash. Streets disappeared. Maps became useless. What remained was a maze of shattered factories, collapsed apartment blocks, and cellars carved into the earth. It was here, in this environment of total destruction, that the weapon introduced in desperation during 1941 would become inseparable from the identity of the Red Army. Stalingrad was not a battle of sweeping maneuvers. It was a battle measured in meters, stairwells, and rooms. Control of a single building could change hands multiple times in one day. Visibility was often reduced to a few yards by smoke, dust, and darkness. In these conditions, traditional infantry tactics collapsed. Long-range accuracy meant little. What mattered was who could react faster, fire more, and keep advancing when fear told them to stop. Soviet command recognized this reality quickly. Entire assault units were reorganized around close-quarters combat. Rifle platoons were re-equipped with submachine guns whenever possible. The weapon that had been rushed into service the previous year now flooded the streets of Stalingrad in unprecedented numbers. Soldiers carried it slung across their chests, fingers already on the trigger as they moved through rubble-choked corridors and shell holes. For German troops, the psychological impact was immediate. Veterans later recalled that the sound of Soviet submachine guns echoed endlessly through the ruins, bouncing off concrete walls and metal beams. It was impossible to tell how many attackers were advancing. A handful of Soviet soldiers could sound like an entire company. German defensive positions, designed for coordinated fire and maneuver, were overwhelmed by sudden, violent bursts of automatic fire erupting from doorways, stairwells, and sewer openings. From the Soviet perspective, the weapon was doing exactly what it had been designed to do. It neutralized German advantages in training and coordination by replacing precision with chaos. New recruits, some with only days of preparation, could be effective simply by advancing and firing. Commanders encouraged relentless aggression. Retreat was punished severely. Forward movement, no matter the cost, was rewarded. The battlefield became an environment where hesitation was deadlier than recklessness. Yet, as the fighting intensified, the darker side of this approach became impossible to ignore at the soldier level. Assaults were often launched with minimal coordination. Multiple units converged on the same objectives through narrow approaches. In the noise and confusion, distinguishing friend from foe became nearly impossible. The weapon's high rate of fire meant that once the trigger was pulled, bullets went everywhere. In enclosed spaces, ricochets turned walls and floors into secondary weapons. Men were struck by rounds fired by comrades only a few steps away. Others were hit when weapons discharged accidentally during falls or collisions in the rubble. Drum magazines, already heavy and awkward, caught on debris, throwing soldiers off balance. When dropped, the weapon could fire if the bolt slammed forward. These incidents were rarely spoken of openly. To admit them would have undermined morale and raised questions no one in authority wanted answered. Stalingrad's winter made everything worse. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Metal contracted, springs stiffened, oil turned to sludge. Soldiers wrapped rags around their weapons, removed lubrication entirely, or fired them dry in hopes of preventing malfunctions. This solved some problems and created others. Increased wear led to unpredictable behavior.
A weapon that had already been difficult to control became even more dangerous under stress.
Despite this, Soviet command doubled down. Factories, now fully mobilized, were producing the weapon in staggering numbers. Output reached levels that astonished even Soviet planners. The logic was brutally simple. A weapon that could be built in hours rather than days was worth any trade-off. If one failed, another would replace it. If a soldier fell, another would take his place. The Red Army was not fighting to preserve individuals, it was fighting to exhaust the enemy. German intelligence reports from late 1942 reflect a growing awareness of this reality. They noted the increasing density of automatic weapons in Soviet units and the psychological toll it took on German soldiers. Defensive positions that might have held against rifle fire collapsed under the pressure of constant close-range assaults. The Germans began modifying their own tactics, avoiding prolonged engagements in ruined buildings whenever possible. Some German units actively sought captured Soviet weapons, valuing their firepower in urban combat. Ironically, German soldiers often used the weapon more conservatively than its original users. With stricter fire discipline and better training, they mitigated some of its dangers. Soviet soldiers, by contrast, were encouraged to unleash its full potential. Fire superiority was not a concept, it was a flood. As the battle dragged on into early 1943, Stalingrad became a turning point not just strategically, but culturally within the Red Army. The weapon became a symbol of survival through brutality. Songs, slogans, and propaganda celebrated it as a tool of vengeance and resilience. Photographs showed soldiers advancing through smoke with it held at the hip, faces hardened and unreadable. These images would later define the popular memory of the Eastern Front.
But those images hid what veterans carried with them long after the war. Letters home hinted at fear that had nothing to do with the enemy. Diaries mentioned confusion, sudden losses, and moments when entire squads vanished in seconds without clear explanation. The battlefield consumed men indiscriminately, and the weapon's role in that consumption was quietly understood by those closest to it. By the time the German Sixth Army surrendered in February 1943, the Red Army had proven that it could not be broken. The victory at Stalingrad marked the beginning of a relentless Soviet advance westward. The weapon that had once been an emergency solution was now a central pillar of Soviet infantry doctrine. It would accompany Soviet soldiers across Ukraine, Poland, and eventually into the heart of Germany itself. Yet with each step west, the cost accumulated. Friendly fire incidents, accidental discharges, and uncontrolled bursts continued to claim lives. These losses were absorbed into the vast statistics of the war, indistinguishable from those caused by enemy fire. Official histories would later focus on heroism, sacrifice, and industrial triumph. The uncomfortable details were left out. What few realized at the time was that the Red Army was becoming dependent on a weapon that shaped behavior as much as tactics. It encouraged aggression over caution, speed over coordination, and volume over control. It won battles, but it also trained soldiers to accept chaos as normal and death as inevitable, even from their own side. As the front moved west in 1944, this dependence would reach its peak. And it was then, in the final phase of the war, that the true reason this weapon's story was quietly simplified after victory would become clear.
On 30 April 1945, as Soviet artillery thundered through the ruins of Berlin, the war in Europe was already decided. The Red Army had crossed half a continent, crushing everything in its path, and now stood inside the heart of Nazi Germany itself. The streets were filled with smoke, rubble, and the echoes of automatic fire. For the men advancing block by block, the final battles felt eerily familiar. Berlin, like Stalingrad before it, had become a close-range nightmare of cellars, stairwells, and shattered rooms, and once again the same weapon dominated the soundscape of the battlefield. By this stage of the war, the submachine gun was everywhere. Entire Soviet units were equipped almost exclusively with it. The Red Army no longer resembled the force that had nearly collapsed in 1941. It was larger, harder, and brutally experienced. But the habits formed over years of fighting had not changed. Soldiers advanced aggressively, firing continuously, overwhelming resistance through sheer volume. In Berlin's confined spaces, that approach was devastating. German defenders, exhausted and outnumbered, were pushed back relentlessly. Yet beneath the surface of victory, the cost continued to mount in ways that would never appear in victory speeches. The same chaotic conditions that had plagued Stalingrad now repeated themselves on an even larger scale. Multiple assault groups converged on the same buildings, smoke obscured vision, communication between units broke down. In the noise of battle, orders were shouted, misheard, or ignored entirely. And once again, bullets fired in panic or momentum did not discriminate. Veterans later described moments when entire corridors erupted in gunfire from both directions, Soviet against Soviet, until someone realized what was happening and screamed for it to stop. Others recalled comrades falling without ever seeing an enemy, struck by rounds fired seconds earlier in a different room. These were not isolated incidents. They were the natural outcome of a doctrine built on speed, aggression, and overwhelming firepower in confined spaces.
When Berlin fell and Germany surrendered, the Soviet Union emerged as one of the war's two great victors. The cost, however, was staggering. Tens of millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered across an entire continent. In the aftermath, the Soviet state faced a new challenge: how to explain this victory. History had to be shaped, simplified, and made useful. Weapons became symbols, soldiers became heroes, sacrifice became noble rather than chaotic. The submachine gun was elevated into legend. It appeared in parades, monuments, and war films. It was portrayed as the people's weapon, the tool that allowed ordinary workers and peasants to defeat a technologically advanced enemy. Its flaws were ignored. Its dangers were never discussed publicly. To acknowledge them would have complicated the narrative of triumph and raised uncomfortable questions about leadership decisions and human cost. Official military histories focused on production numbers, tactical success, and enemy casualties. Friendly fire incidents were absorbed into general loss figures. Accidental deaths were attributed to the fog of war without detail. Veterans learned quickly which stories were welcomed and which were not. Those who spoke openly risked being labeled unreliable or unpatriotic. Many chose silence instead. But silence did not erase memory. Decades later, in private conversations and unpublished memoirs, a different picture emerged. Soldiers spoke of fear, not just of the enemy, but of losing control. They remembered the weapon's power and its unpredictability. They remembered moments when survival felt like luck rather than skill. And they remembered understanding, even at the time, that the weapon was dangerous to everyone nearby. This is where the final truth of the story reveals itself. The weapon was never misunderstood by those who designed or issued it. Soviet leadership knew exactly what they were accepting. They understood that high rates of fire, minimal training, and mass assaults would inevitably lead to friendly losses. But they also understood something else, something colder and more strategic. In a war of annihilation, where the enemy sought not just defeat but destruction, the Soviet Union could not afford restraint. The weapon was not meant to be safe. It was meant to be simple, terrifying, and expendable, just like the doctrine it supported. It replaced precision with pressure, caution with momentum, and individual survival with collective advance. The lives lost to its flaws were not hidden because they were unknown. They were hidden because they were considered acceptable within the larger equation of survival.
This is the reason the story was rewritten after the war. To admit that victory depended in part on a weapon that killed its own soldiers would have undermined the moral clarity of triumph. It would have revealed that the line between heroism and tragedy was thinner than anyone wanted to admit. Instead, the weapon became a symbol of strength rather than desperation, of mastery rather than necessity. And yet, without it, the war may have ended very differently. In the ruined cities of the Eastern Front, where close-range combat decided everything, this weapon gave the Red Army an edge that no amount of discipline or training alone could have provided in 1941 and 1942. It allowed an unprepared army to adapt, survive, and eventually overwhelm an enemy that had expected a swift victory. So here is the final answer to the mystery that began with that terrifying sound. The weapon was feared not because it was poorly designed, but because it embodied the brutal logic of total war. It was dangerous because the war itself demanded danger without limits. It helped win World War II, not despite killing its own soldiers, but because it reflected a strategy willing to accept that cost in exchange for victory. That truth was too heavy for monuments and too complex for propaganda, so it was buried beneath simpler stories of courage and steel. But history, when examined closely, always reveals what was left unsaid. And in the end, the most unsettling lesson of all is this: the weapon did exactly what it was built to do. It turned chaos into a weapon, fear into momentum, and sacrifice into strategy. And once unleashed, it could not tell friend from foe, just as the war itself could not tell the difference between victory and loss until everything was already destroyed.